Hi everyone, this is Nancy. We're doing an informal recap class of the musculoskeletal system that we did the last week of September, Wednesday. So I'm going to go over the vocabulary list. So get out your vocabulary list, your anatomy coloring book, and hopefully another anatomy book, and some paper and pencil, and let's get started. So again, main textbook. Oops. I'm hand holding the video here. So I'm working out of the third edition. Fourth edition's a few pages earlier most of the time. Okay, so let's get started. Going through our vocabulary list here and getting to know your anatomy coloring book. Oh, we'll do another one for the cell very soon, by the way. And tissues. I love talking about tissues because they all heal differently. We did talk about this, the three types of muscle tissue, which you can see we find in what they call the skeletal system because they actually move the joints. We talked about cardiac tissue, special tissue in the heart that can conduct that charge so it never stops contracting and beating. And we talked about smooth muscles, which are wrapped around things like arteries and the digestive system. We briefly talked about sliding or contraction physiology, meaning to make long explanation short, they slide in together. I kind of use my fingers to illustrate that the belly of the muscle slides in. So anyway, we're going to get into nervous system next week. So the beginning of this book, it's got a lot more information than you need, but last week we also talked about how briefly the nerves reach out into the belly of the muscle, and that's what stimulates a contraction or shortening of the muscle belly. Cross-section of a muscle belly. Okay, so let's get into, this is one of the assignments that you were to refer to. This is what they call a long bone. It's one of four basic bone shapes. But this one's cool because it shows the hard compact bone, which is very dense, does not need blood supply, and yet in the center, the core of many bones, is the marrow. And that's very much living tissue where bone cells, blood cells, most importantly, red and white blood cells are actually born. So this is like typical long bone. This happens to be the femur. This goes into the hip socket. So this is a good one to read over, and it talks about the different types of bone. This is great for studying for an exam. And this is what they call the skeleton, the overview. And we did talk about this. We talked about the axial versus the arms and the legs, or the appendicular. So basically, they just broke it up into two sections. This one, I want you to color. So in the fourth edition, it would be plate 19. So definitely you want to color that one if you haven't already. A lot of you have already done that, a couple of you for sure. This is just a typical thing about articulations or joints, which we talked about. Types of joints refer to how they move. Do they pivot around each other? Do they hinge, like a door, which would be your knees, for example. And so this is, again, good for studying for a test, as well as knowing some of the actions of the muscles. Because when muscles cross these joints, they will either, rotate it, or they will open and close a joint, like we talked about the elbow and the knee. So these are good basic movements and terms that you'll see in muscle names. This is just a random idealized joint that shows some of the things. Well, potentially all of the things. Very few joints have them all. So this is sort of a collective diagram of what everything possibly could be in a movable joint. And you see cartilage and you see ligaments. Ligaments, remember, hold bone to bone. They stabilize. And then there's a synovial membrane, which holds this fluid like egg white. Some joints are not very movable, and, like the sutures of our skull. So this is just all about articulations or joints. So now this part, we also talked about range of motion. These are the actual names showing how the different articulations move. We went over this. Well, we didn't go over all of the terms. I see inversion, eversion, which refers to the. Actually, we didn't go over all this yet. Okay, so this will, however, come up. We've only done one musculoskeletal class. There's another one. So this, again, refers to muscle names. You don't have to worry about this too much, actually, at this point. We did talk about flexion of the digits or fingers, but we didn't really go into all this yet. But this is another example of how some muscles are named. You know, we talked about a long muscle that flexes the digit. And so it's called flexor digitorum longus. So anyway, this just gives you the something you're going to need to know when you really get into muscle actions. So back to the skeleton, the entire head or skull is broken into two parts. The facial bones are just in the front, obviously, the face. Everything else is called the cranium. So when you talk about something being towards the head, they say it's cranial because it's towards the top of the body, the head. You don't have to know the names of these bones, but remember, interesting that Halloween's coming up when I record this, they're not totally fused. And we did talk about the mandible or jaw being the only truly movable bone. The other interesting thing is that if you turn, you can take a little peek, this is a three-dimensional skull. The bone isn't just on the outside. Yeah, and if you ever study cranial sacral therapy, this is what shifts, these internal bones, which protect and hold the brain, as well as this little cup that holds the pituitary gland. But this is beyond the scope of practice for even a massage exam. Okay, so now we're getting into some specifics about the jaw. That's good if you have a TMJ problem. You might study that in your future. Now, this is one that you need to put on your list to color and read. So that'd be about 25 or so. And this is the side view or lateral view of the spine. We talked about this in class. This person is looking, well, here you can see, this is a side view. The front of the body or anterior part would be this way. So this would be a forward curve, a backward curve, a forward curve, a backward curve, or anterior, posterior, anterior, posterior. And these regions of the vertebral column, which is actually what the spine is. The neck is the cervical. Here we have the thoracic, where the rib cage is, rib cage bones anchor. Then we have this low back lumbar region, and of course the sacrum and little teeny coccyx or tailbone. So we talked about the actual spine, that nickname came from these processes that you can feel on the back of a person. Remember, this is the inside or anterior surface, the smooth part. This is the weight-bearing part, the actual bodies, they call it, of the vertebra. And that's where the cartilage discs are for shock absorption. So this is designed for shock absorption. We mentioned that, as well as these processes, these bony processes like the spinous processes, are designed for ligament and muscle attachment points. So this is cool because, and you will see this, it shows excessive or abnormal curvatures And though that's a good exam question. Kyphosis refers to a lack of cervical curve, B, excessive lumbar curve, C, excessive thoracic curve, D, a lack of sacrum or whatever. That's kind of the level of a typical exam. This is showing a cross section of two vertebrae and the little disc or cartilage in between. So this is kind of cool, but you don't have to color it. You could. I'd just color this part maybe, but don't get too lost in that one. More detail about a vertebra, and in particular, they're focusing on the neck. Luckily, these don't have names except for the first two. Anyway, the vertebral column bones are, except for two at the very under the skull, are named by number. Yeah, T for thoracic, 12 for the 12th one. As you count, always count from top to bottom. Okay, rib cage. Anyway, you can go on and you can look. This is why they call it a flat bone, because even though it's curved, it's flat if you did a cross section. We did palpate the sternal notch. We did talk about the shoulder a little bit, which is the beginning. What we talked about specifically last time was the beginning of the appendicular system outside of axial. The beginning of the arms and legs starts with the shoulder girdle, which would be the clavicle and the scapula or shoulder blade, as well as the pelvic girdle. So that's the beginning of the appendicular system. So that's good to know. Okay, so lots of details, more than we need to worry about right now. I would strongly recommend for a review, open book, you go through and you name the bones, and you can flip back and forth. This is how you would do your independent study. Again, you can save it for when you get close to an exam too. But this helps you here. So for you guys, about 34 or so. This helps you to understand the exact attachment point. If it says a muscle attaches on the ulna, the proximal ulna, you have to think proximal ulna. The elbow. See, so this will be very useful not only for exam but for bony palpation, which we do in Lomi Lomi, and other massage therapies, of course. Here's the pelvis. So again, this is now appendicular system. Details about the pelvis. Lots of details. Remember, this is a pre-med book. And then, of course, the leg articulates. The femur here, this biggest bone in the body of 206 bones, articulates into the pelvic girdle. And that's the ball and socket joint. That is the actual hip joint. It's not on top of the pelvis. Put your hands on your hips. Jumping jacks, all that. No, this is actually the hip. It's not that protrusion you feel, greater trochanter. It's the actual ball and socket joint. Okay, so, here's a cross-section of a knee. Any of you who have knee problems, that's a really cool cartilage called the meniscus, or plural menisci. Yeah, the knee's very commonly injured because it only opens and closes. We did talk about the Achilles tendon, the musculoskeletal relationship between the calf muscle, which anchors into the heel of the foot, thereby moving the foot. Good exam question. Heel of the foot is the calcaneus. So you have both side or lateral views, inside, medial side, and lateral. So here's another good way to study, going into detail, naming the bones. This one's called Joints in Review. This is a great open book way to study and verbally talk to yourself as you do it. Humerus, scapula. It just, it helps embed it into your brain. So it'd be about page 41. Here's a cross section in a little more detail than we talked about of a muscle. But we did talk briefly about connective tissue bundling or fascia and how it wraps and packages the muscle belly. This is a cross section or looking into the belly of the muscle or the vascular part, meaning it has blood vessels. And it's very cellular. And that's where all the shortening, all the characteristics of muscle tissue happen. The lengthening, the shortening, the elasticity, and the response to nerve. And do know those 4 words that we talked about. I'm sure you took notes on that, right? Characteristics of muscle. I am going to give you a little open book quiz, by the way. But so here we are looking at the biceps in the front. This person's looking that way, lifting up a glass of water or something. So biceps flexes or bends the elbow. Triceps extends it, especially in certain positions. Muscles only work when they have to work, like against a resistance or against gravity. But that's another whole topic. It's called concentric and eccentric contractions. But we didn't talk about that yet. Anyway, so this goes into some basic, how do muscles work anyway? We did talk about how the belly attaches into the bone, and it has to cross that joint in order to affect the movement of that joint. So that's the logic there. So that's the biceps and the triceps, primary movers of the elbow joint. So we also talked about how some muscles don't attach to the bone, but they attach to themselves. They make circles. And we talked about how the action of that muscle closes an opening. And usually it's named orbicularis because it makes an orbit. It goes all the way around, for example, oculi, oris, the eye and the mouth. Found also, they're also called sphincter muscles. Anyway. Okay, so now we're getting into specific muscles of the body, which we haven't talked about. But what we did talk about were basically how muscles get their names. So here we have, these are the rotator cuff muscles. And when we start to learn muscle names, it can be intimidating, but if you learn just to break it down, it helps. We did talk about how sometimes muscles are named for their shape, like the trapezius, which makes a trapezoid shape. This one, they're also named for their location. Okay, we talked about this muscle. Some of you had already left. It was in the end of class. But we did talk about the pectoralis major. Pectoralis is the location name. Major is a size. In this case, there's a smaller one called the pectoralis minor. So the name is telling you where it is and that there's a big one and a little one. So it's in the chest, right? So you have to start looking for clues in names. Another one we talked about were, here we go. We talked about flexors of the fingers. Remember this crosses, and we talked about how some of them are long, like they come from the forearm and they go into, this one only goes to the wrist, but these go all the way to the fingers and the thumb.